For 5 centuries, Hollywood gave us a comfortable lie. A pale aristocrat in a silk cloak, afraid of garlic and wooden stakes. The truth that spawned that myth is far more disturbing. The man behind Dracula never needed fangs. He turned human suffering into a political language so brutal that the largest military force on the planet turned around and marched home. His name was Vlad III of Wallachia. For his allies, he was the only wall standing between Christian Europe and total Ottoman conquest. For his enemies, he was something they had no word for. A prince who engineered horror the way architects design cathedrals, with precision, with purpose, and with an audience in mind. And the most devastating part of his strategy did not involve soldiers. It involved the women of the Ottoman Empire, wives, daughters, mothers, seized in raids and turned into a spectacle so shocking it was designed to shatter the will of an entire civilization before a single battle was fought. We are going to trace every step of this story. From the years Vlad spent as a boy locked inside the Sultan's palace, learning the exact fears of the empire he would one day destroy. Through the bloody path that put him on a throne no one expected him to keep, all the way to the night when thousands of Ottoman scouts crested a hill and discovered an entire valley transformed into a forest of impaled human bodies, many of them women, stretching to the horizon under torchlight. When this is over, you will have to make a choice. Was Vlad a nation's last desperate hope, or something history should never have forgiven? Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from right now. And if stories like this are why you are here, hit subscribe so you never miss one. This is Ancestral, the best dark history channel on the planet. In 1442, everything an 11-year-old boy understood about the world collapsed in a single afternoon. Vlad, born heir to the throne of Wallachia, did not lose his future to war or plague. He lost it to a handshake. His own father surrendered him and his younger brother Radu to Sultan Mehmed II as breathing guarantees of loyalty. They were not diplomats. They were not students. They were children used as currency, proof in bone and blood that Wallachia would not step out of line. For a boy raised on stories of Ottoman cruelty, the betrayal was absolute. One day, he was a prince learning to rule. The next, he was a captive walking through palace corridors filled with the language of his enemy. Everything around him shifted. The prayers were different. The customs were foreign. The faces watching him belonged to the very people his family had warned him about since birth. But none of that hurt as much as the invisible wound, the understanding that his own father had weighed his sons against his throne and chosen the throne. The place that would forge him was an Ottoman citadel far from anything he knew, a fortress where authority was not simply held, but performed like theater. Inside those walls, Vlad and Radu were raised alongside the Sultan's own heir, Mehmed, the future conqueror who would one day tear Constantinople from the hands of Christendom. On the surface, this was a privilege. Beneath it, the arrangement was a leash. If their father ever broke his oath, his sons would be the first to pay. The brothers received an education that most European nobles could only dream of: philosophy, astronomy, languages, theology, the art of calligraphy. They were trained in horsemanship, combat, and military strategy. But the lessons that buried deepest into Vlad's mind never came from any classroom. They came from what he witnessed with his own eyes when someone dared to challenge the empire holding him prisoner. He watched how the Ottomans handled disobedience among their elite Janissary corps. He saw what became of towns that refused tribute. He observed officers broken not behind closed doors, but in open courtyards, where every cry of pain carried a second purpose: instruction. Inside the empire, fear was never accidental. It was architecture. When a settlement defied the Sultan, it was not merely conquered. It was unmade in a way designed to echo across provinces. The aftermath was left visible, bodies arranged where caravans would pass, ruins left standing as monuments to disobedience. Vlad absorbed every detail: the choreography of public executions, the positioning of remains along trade routes, the way a single act of violence, staged correctly, could govern 1,000 miles without another sword being drawn. It was savagery dressed as statecraft. Radu responded to captivity by surrendering to it completely. He embraced Islam, adopted the customs of the court, and earned the affection of those around him. The silk, the music, the intellectual gardens of Ottoman culture became his world. He thrived. Vlad traveled the opposite path. Every year inside those walls turned him quieter, colder, more watchful. He did not assimilate. He catalogued. He studied the empire the way a prisoner studies the habits of his jailer, memorizing every routine, every weakness, every blind spot. During the frozen nights of his captivity, Vlad arrived at a conclusion that would govern every decision he ever made. In a world where empires swallowed nations whole, a small kingdom did not survive through diplomacy or decency. It survived by becoming so terrifying that even the strongest predator calculated the cost twice before striking. You could not afford to be prey. You could not even settle for being an ordinary threat. You had to become something so unpredictable, so savage in your response, that giants preferred to leave you alone. Compassion, in that equation, was a death sentence. The citadel where he spent his youth was less an academy and more a workshop in psychological destruction. Vlad witnessed interrogations, mass floggings, ceremonial beheadings, and collective punishments executed with chilling discipline. He studied how the empire selected locations for spectacle, how it arranged the dead, how it timed its violence so the image of suffering outlasted the suffering itself. The principle was brutal and elegant. A mind exposed to enough horror surrenders long before the body gives out. Years ground forward. When Vlad was finally released and pointed back toward Wallachia, the boy who had been handed over no longer existed in any recognizable form. In his place walked a man who had spent his formative years inside the belly of an empire and emerged not converted, but weaponized. His intellect was a blade. Whatever warmth had once lived in him now lay buried beneath years of calculated silence. He moved toward his homeland, carrying a single conviction scorched into every part of him. Wallachia would either become something the world feared, or it would cease to exist entirely. What awaited him was not a kingdom ready to welcome its prince. Wallachia was a bruised strip of land crushed between two giants: Catholic Hungary, pressing from the north, and the Ottoman Empire, grinding from the south. The soil was poor. Lawlessness had spread like disease. Peasants withered, while the local aristocracy, the boyars, gorged themselves on corruption. These nobles had perfected the art of treachery over generations. They had overthrown rulers, switched loyalties on command, and most unforgivably, they had orchestrated the assassination of Vlad's own father and the burial alive of his eldest brother. For Vlad, this was not abstract governance. This was vengeance fused with survival. He understood with absolute clarity that if he attempted to manage this rotting system with patience and negotiation, the boyars would dismantle him exactly as they had dismantled every ruler before him. If he wanted a nation capable of standing against the Ottomans, he first had to tear out the decay festering inside Wallachia's own walls. His opening move was disguised in elegance. Vlad summoned the nobility to a lavish banquet at Targovishte, his royal seat. He offered them exquisite food, generous gifts, and rivers of spiced wine. He let them celebrate, let them posture, let them believe their new prince could be managed. Some of the men raising their cups had participated directly in the murder of his family. Not one of them suspected that the meal they were enjoying would be their last. When the final toasts were made and the torches began to gutter, Vlad gave his order. The exits were sealed. Armed men flooded the hall. The performance was over. Dozens of boyars were killed where they sat. Others were dragged away in chains. But Vlad had no interest in merely eliminating the men at the top. He intended to annihilate the entire class structure that had kept Wallachia weak. The wives and daughters of those executed nobles, women who had never known a day of physical hardship, were stripped of their status, bound, and marched toward the mountains. Under punishing heat and brutal highland winds, these women were forced to construct the fortress of Poenari with their own hands. Fine garments disintegrated into filthy strips. Hands that had never touched rough stone cracked open, skin splitting, nails torn away as they dragged masonry up impossible slopes. Many collapsed and never rose again. Those who endured emerged as different creatures entirely. Vlad's statement was absolute. No title, no bloodline, no gender would shield anyone from serving his vision. You were either a functioning piece of his new state, or you were raw material consumed in its construction. From that point forward, his domestic rule operated on a single principle: total obedience or total destruction. Theft, idleness, dishonesty, nothing was treated as minor. Legends describe a golden cup left at a public fountain, available for any traveler to use, untouched for years because every person in Wallachia understood the price of stealing under Vlad's watch. But his reach extended far beyond criminals and corrupt nobles. He targeted anyone he deemed to be failing their purpose, and that judgment fell on women he considered unproductive or defiant with the same force it fell on anyone else. In his mind, a human being was not a soul. A human being was a role, and if the role went unfilled, the person filling it became disposable. While he hammered order into his own territory, the pressure from the south intensified. The Ottomans demanded their annual tribute: gold, cattle, grain, and something that cut far deeper. Christian boys ripped from their families and reshaped into Janissary soldiers. Every child taken was a future erased. A son turned into a weapon aimed back at his own people. Vlad understood this system with a hatred that went beyond politics. He had lived inside it. He had breathed its air. He despised it with the kind of cold, patient fury that does not fade. In 1459, he made his decision. No more tribute, no more submission. And he did not communicate this through diplomacy. He chose a gesture so violent it could never be misread. When Ottoman envoys arrived at his court and declined to remove their turbans, citing religious tradition, Vlad instructed his soldiers to assist them. Iron nails were driven through the fabric, through the scalp, and into the bone beneath. The turbans and the skulls wearing them became permanently united. This was not a diplomatic incident. It was an invitation to annihilation. Vlad understood the mechanics perfectly. No empire could permit a minor vassal to mutilate its ambassadors and remain credible. The Sultan would be forced to respond with overwhelming violence. Vlad also knew he could never face the Ottoman military machine in open combat. Numbers, siege weapons, resources, every conventional advantage belonged to the enemy. So he committed himself entirely to the one battlefield where he believed a small nation could win against an empire: the battlefield of the mind. In the winter of 1461, he made a move the Ottomans never anticipated. Instead of fortifying his borders and waiting for invasion, he crossed the frozen Danube and struck Ottoman territory first. This was not a campaign of conquest or glory. It was an operation designed to dismantle courage itself. Settlement after settlement was reduced to ash. Fields were destroyed. Animals were butchered where they stood. Families, men, women, children, were torn from their homes without distinction. In correspondence sent to the Hungarian king, Vlad reported his results with the detached precision of a clerk filing inventory. He provided exact figures: 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians put to death, not including those who burned alive inside their own homes. For Vlad, these were not atrocities. They were data points, evidence that he was doing whatever the defense of Christendom required. But beneath the arithmetic lay something far more unsettling. He was refining methods of psychological warfare, the way an engineer tests prototypes, adjusting, measuring, improving. In the warfare of that era, captured women were almost never killed in large numbers. They represented value, as slaves, as leverage, as labor. They had an economic logic that protected them. Vlad chose to incinerate that logic entirely. He began collecting captives without regard for age, sex, or status, and subjected them all to identical fates. He wanted the Ottoman soldiers tracking his path to discover not just fallen warriors, but obliterated families. He wanted them to encounter the complete destruction of civilian life, arranged deliberately for maximum psychological impact. This is when he perfected the technique that would permanently attach itself to his name: impalement. The stake was not designed for swift execution. It was engineered to extend agony for as long as the human body could sustain it. A tall wooden pole was carefully rounded at the tip and coated with oil. It was then forced into the victim through the lower body at a precise angle calculated to bypass vital organs, traveling slowly upward through the torso. The victim was then hoisted vertical, the base of the pole planted in the earth, gravity pulling the body downward inch by inch. Death was not immediate. It arrived over hours, sometimes over days. Beneath open sky, with flies swarming open wounds and carrion birds tearing at exposed flesh, with organs slowly displaced and internal bleeding building without release, the victim became a living monument to suffering. Travelers passing beneath could see faces still contorted in agony, eyes still open, mouths still frozen mid-scream. It was brutality transformed into public installation, and Vlad deployed it with increasing sophistication. He paid particular attention to mothers. Captured women with children were not quietly absorbed into the machinery of war or traded as property. They were raised on stakes in the most visible positions available. The message roared louder than any battlefield trumpet. I am not only destroying your armies, I am reaching into your homes. I am turning your wives, your daughters, your unborn futures into instruments of war. He understood that for many soldiers marching under the Ottoman banner, the image of their own women subjected to this fate was more devastating than any wound they could suffer themselves. The air along the Danube thickened with the smell of char and decomposition. Vultures wheeled in columns above endless rows of the dead. Villages stood hollow. Water sources ran foul. Those who escaped carried what they had witnessed into every corner of the empire. And the stories moved faster than any cavalry column could ride. That was precisely the point. Word of this campaign of horror reached Constantinople. The crown jewel Mehmed II had ripped from Byzantine hands barely a decade earlier. The Sultan who had breached the legendary walls of the Second Rome now fixed his attention on the insignificant principality that had dared to humiliate him. He had already proven he could drag artillery across continents, reduce fortifications to rubble, and drown ancient civilizations in blood. But Vlad had struck at something more vulnerable than military infrastructure. He had attacked the empire's dignity in full view of every ally and rival watching. Mehmed mobilized everything. From every province of his domain, he summoned janissaries, mounted cavalry, infantry divisions, combat engineers, and heavy artillery. Contemporary accounts estimate 60,000 soldiers, perhaps 80,000, possibly more, assembling like a gathering thunderhead. This was not a retaliatory strike. This was a campaign of erasure, designed to remove Vlad from existence and force Wallachia back into submission, or grind it into dust. Vlad knew exactly what was approaching. He had spent his childhood inside the machine, now aimed at him. He understood that meeting this force in conventional battle meant the end of Wallachia in a single afternoon. So he prepared a different kind of war entirely. Croplands were set ablaze before the invaders could harvest them. Wells were contaminated with animal carcasses and poison. Entire villages were evacuated and left as empty shells. His own people suffered immensely, but he had decided there was no alternative. If his nation could not defeat the empire with weapons, it would defeat it with desolation and dread. As spring of 1462 bled into summer, the Ottoman army began its advance northward, a vast river of steel and flesh flowing toward Wallachia. Advance scouts rode ahead expecting the familiar texture of frontier warfare. Probing skirmishes, minor fortifications, perhaps the occasional ambush in a mountain pass. What they encountered was something else entirely. A wrongness in the silence, fields reduced to black stubble, dwellings standing without a single living occupant, livestock rotting where it had fallen. The deeper they pushed, the stranger the landscape became. No fleeing civilians, no predictable resistance, only an occasional body left in plain view. Crude scaffolds erected at crossroads, and the persistent sensation of being observed from the tree line. The rumors about Vlad that had once seemed like exaggerated propaganda began to feel less like stories and more like warnings. Before we follow those riders to what waited for them at the end of that road, let me say something. If you have made it this far into this story, you are not here by accident. You want history told without filters, without shortcuts, with every difficult truth left intact. That is exactly why we built our inner circle, the lineage. It is more than a membership. When you join, you become part of the small group of people who make investigations like this one possible. People who refuse to settle for surface-level history. Members receive early access to new content and exclusive material, but more importantly, they help shape which buried stories we unearth next. If this is the kind of history you believe should exist, consider joining the lineage and standing alongside the team behind Ancestral. Because beyond the scorched earth and the poisoned water, Vlad was engineering one final act. Not a skirmish, not a conventional massacre. A spectacle so profoundly horrifying that even the man who had conquered Constantinople would find himself unable to advance. And at the heart of that nightmare, once again, were women, transformed into weapons of war without ever holding a blade. What those Ottoman riders discovered when they finally reached the approaches to the Wallachian capital was not a demolished city or a crumbling defense line. It was something that defied the categories of warfare entirely. A landscape where the horizon itself seemed populated by human figures. A forest constructed not from timber, but from the bodies of Vlad's enemies. And the message he had carved into the earth for the most powerful empire on the planet was only beginning to be understood. The Ottoman scouts who first crested that ridge were not inexperienced men. They had ridden through devastated provinces, witnessed the aftermath of raids, buried comrades taken by ambush, but nothing in their collective experience had equipped them for what Vlad had constructed in the approaches to Targovishte. As the valley opened before them, they did not see a defensive position or a ruined settlement. They saw an endless grid of tall wooden poles, and on every pole, a human body. Later sources describe a field stretching nearly 3 kilometers in length and a full kilometer across. Not a forest of timber, a forest of flesh. Contemporary chroniclers place the number at roughly 20,000. This was not the scattered carnage left behind after a battle. It was organized, intentional. The highest-ranking captives had been mounted on the tallest stakes near the center, as though Vlad had imposed a grotesque order of rank even upon the dead. Surrounding them in widening rows were soldiers, farmers, elderly men, adolescent boys, and women. Most military leaders of that century, savage as many of them were, observed certain unspoken boundaries when it came to female captives. They might be enslaved, violated, bartered. But the mass public execution of women on this scale was virtually unknown. Vlad shattered that convention deliberately. He dragged women to the very center of the display. Witnesses recall long hair stirring in the breeze, garments stiff with filth and dried blood, bare feet dangling motionless. Some of the bodies had already begun to decompose. Others were recent enough that their final expressions remained legible on their faces. What shattered the observers most completely were the mothers. Some had been impaled within arm's reach of their children. Others had their infants fixed to the same stake. Tiny forms lashed or pierced alongside the bodies that had carried them. It is impossible at this distance to separate precise documentation from the inevitable distortion of horror. But the pattern across every account is consistent. Vlad had made the family unit itself part of the weapon. He wanted every Ottoman soldier staring at those women to see his own wife, his own daughter, his own mother. Impalement, as Vlad practiced it, was not improvised fury. It was a technique refined for duration and visibility. The victim was positioned so that death would arrive as slowly as the body could sustain. The pole was angled to initially bypass the heart and the major arteries. Once the body was hoisted upright and the base planted in the ground, gravity became the executioner, pulling the victim downward by fractions. Pain, dehydration, and systemic shock completed the process. A single person could remain suspended and conscious for many hours, sometimes longer, while the living world moved beneath them. By the time Mehmed II reached the field with the bulk of his forces on June 17, 1462, most of those on the stakes had already died. But the enormity of the scene remained intact. The smell arrived first: putrefaction, old blood, human waste baking in the heat. Then the visual struck. Row upon row of poles, clouds of insects, dark birds pulling strings of tissue from exposed wounds. The atmosphere was saturated. There was no direction a man could turn his head without confronting it. Mehmed was no stranger to atrocity. He had shattered the defenses of Constantinople. He had sanctioned mass killings. He had executed rivals within his own bloodline. And yet Ottoman and Italian chroniclers alike, many of them openly hostile to Vlad, converge on the same observation. The scene disturbed him visibly. One account describes the Sultan pulling his cloak across his face as he rode past the rows of the dead, unable to hold his gaze on what his enemy had engineered. Different sources preserve different versions of what passed through his mind, but all of them orbit the same realization. How do you wage war against a man willing to do this? How do you break someone who has already abandoned every convention, every boundary of ordinary conduct, in order to terrify you. In certain versions, Mehmed is said to have acknowledged that a ruler capable of such acts possessed a value that transcended any piece of territory. It was revulsion braided with an involuntary recognition of the will behind it. The damage to the army ran deeper than its commander's composure. The soldiers filling the Ottoman ranks were not religious extremists or men indifferent to suffering. They were ordinary men with farms and families scattered across Anatolia and the Balkans. Looking at those impaled women and children, they did not process the scene as a foreign atrocity committed against strangers. They processed it as a preview of what could happen to their own families. Terror bled through the encampments, like a contagion. Men vomited. Others lay awake through the night. Unit cohesion began to fracture. Mehmed assessed the situation with the pragmatism that had made him a conqueror. His soldiers were drained from weeks of marching and relentless guerrilla attacks. Supply lines were collapsing because Vlad had scorched or contaminated his own countryside before the Ottomans could harvest it. The field of the Impaled had struck the army's morale like a siege engine aimed at the mind rather than the walls. This was not the kind of war Mehmed understood. A war of open battles and calculated sieges. It was an attrition of the spirit with no decisive engagement in sight. For what may have been the first time in his military career, the conqueror gave the order to turn back. The command went out: withdraw. The most formidable army in the known world reversed course and marched south, leaving Wallachia unconquered. Vlad had not defeated the empire's forces. He had not destroyed a single Ottoman division in open combat. But he had accomplished something that virtually no strategist of his era believed achievable. He had made the Ottomans conclude that the cost of fighting him on the ground he had chosen exceeded anything they were willing to pay. That victory, however, had been purchased at a staggering price. Wallachia was gutted. Its population had been driven from their homes, scattered into forests, or ground into service. The land itself had been weaponized, and its people treated as expendable components of a defense strategy that valued survival above everything, including the lives of those being defended. Vlad had held his throne for another season, but he had done so by dragging his country and himself across every threshold of acceptable conduct. And the conflict was far from finished. Mehmed understood that sending another massive army northward would only reproduce the same nightmare on a different calendar. So he reached for a more elegant weapon: Vlad's own blood. Radu, the younger brother who had been raised inside the Ottoman court, had long since embraced Islam and woven himself into the fabric of the Sultan's inner circle. Where Vlad was blunt and terrifying, Radu was refined. Where Vlad governed through dread, Radu knew how to offer something people actually wanted: the promise of normalcy. The Sultan equipped Radu with troops and aimed him at Wallachia, carrying a message crafted for exhausted ears. I am not bringing stakes. I am bringing stability. Under my rule, markets will reopen. Fields will be sown again. Taxes will follow a pattern you can predict. No more forests of corpses. No more villages burned by your own prince in the name of resistance. Meanwhile, Vlad continued the only strategy he trusted. He kept burning his own settlements to deny the Ottomans any sustenance. He kept hunting anyone he suspected of disloyalty. For a Wallachian mother sheltering her children in some remote village, the calculus was unbearable. From the south came armies that might seize her sons and daughters as conscripts. From her own ruler's forces came raids that could reduce her home to cinder in the name of national defense. Radu's camp became a magnet for defectors. Boyars who had spent years trembling under Vlad's gaze now saw a doorway out. They sent their families, wives, daughters, children, into Radu's protection as demonstrations of allegiance. For these women, the reversal was disorienting beyond comprehension. One season, Vlad had forced noblewomen to haul stone up mountainsides like draft animals. A few seasons later, their sisters and cousins were being received by his own brother as honored symbols of a gentler order. The approach succeeded systematically. Village by village, estate by estate, Vlad's base of support dissolved. People had simply reached their limit. They were exhausted by life in a nation perpetually prepared to immolate itself. The very fear that had once eradicated crime and imposed discipline now worked against him. If a ruler was as dangerous to his own people as he was to the enemy, then any alternative, even one backed by Ottoman power, began to look like mercy. By the autumn of 1462, Vlad stood nearly alone. His core guard remained loyal, but the broader foundation required to sustain a reign had evaporated. Radu, supported by Ottoman forces and Wallachian nobles, pushed deeper into the country. Vlad withdrew into the brutal safety of the highlands, retreating to the fortress at Poenari, the same stronghold that had been raised by the bleeding hands of noble women years before. The setting for his personal catastrophe could not have carried more weight. Poenari perched high above the Argesh River, accessible only by a steep and merciless ascent. Within its walls, Vlad gathered his last followers and his family. Among them was his wife. Sources conflict on her precise identity, but the account of how her life ended has survived across centuries of local memory. As Radu's forces closed in, fires illuminated the valley floor. The sounds of advancing troops, collapsing structures, and distant shouting filled the mountain air. Vlad's wife watched this unfolding from the fortress walls, understanding with perfect clarity what her capture would mean. She was not an anonymous prisoner. She was the wife of the man half the region wanted dead. If she fell into enemy hands, she would become a trophy, paraded, degraded, possibly destroyed publicly to satisfy the hunger for retribution against her husband. Local tradition holds that she turned to those beside her and spoke a final declaration. She would rather the fish of the river consume her body than allow herself to become a spectacle for her enemies. Then she stepped from the highest point of the fortress and fell toward the Argesh below. Whether her precise words have survived intact or evolved through generations of retelling, the site still bears a name connected to her death, known to this day as the River of the Princess. Vlad escaped that same night through a concealed mountain passage, leaving behind the fortress and the woman who had stood closest to him. His war for Wallachia was effectively over. He had forced an empire to retreat once, but he could not hold his own nobility or even his own household together. He was now a fugitive prince with nothing left but his reputation. He rode toward the kingdom of Hungary, seeking the aid of King Matthias Corvinus, a Christian monarch who had publicly praised Vlad as a champion against Ottoman expansion. Instead of support, he found calculation. Matthias had his own diplomatic arrangements to maintain, his own reputation to manage before the courts of Western Europe. Openly backing a man already notorious as a butcher carried political risks that outweighed any strategic benefit. So the supposed defender of Christendom was quietly placed under arrest. But you cannot simply imprison a figure like Vlad without offering the world a justification. And this is where a different kind of warfare began. A war fought not with stakes and fire, but with ink and paper. Europe was undergoing a transformation. A recent invention, the printing press developed by Johannes Gutenberg, had begun to reshape how information traveled. For the first time in history, pamphlets and inexpensive booklets could be reproduced by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Allies of Matthias and adversaries of Vlad seized this new technology with enthusiasm. They flooded the market with printed accounts accompanied by woodcut illustrations. These images depicted Vlad dining serenely at a table positioned in the middle of a forest of steaks, calmly soaking bread in blood, while executioners dismembered victims around him. Numbers were inflated, scenes were fabricated, gossip was blended seamlessly with documented fact. The objective was transparent: transform Vlad from a ruthless but comprehensible political figure into something outside the boundaries of human behavior entirely. The irony is that this propaganda campaign succeeded so thoroughly, it laid the foundation for the Dracula legend itself. Centuries before Bram Stoker ever put pen to paper, readers across German-speaking Europe and beyond were already devouring sensationalized tales of the Impaler prince. The more grotesque the account, the wider its circulation. Yet even buried within these hostile texts, certain details recur with a frequency that suggests a genuine foundation, particularly regarding Vlad's treatment of women within his own borders. Vlad was consumed by an obsession with order. He believed that labor, discipline, and rigid social hierarchy formed the skeleton of a functional state. When women deviated from the roles he had assigned them, he could be as merciless within his own territory as he had been against any foreign army. One account preserved across multiple sources begins not on a battlefield, but with a simple peasant and a garment. Vlad noticed a man wearing a ragged, poorly made shirt and demanded to know why he was so badly clothed. The man replied that his wife had failed to produce anything better. In most courts, this might have provoked a minor reprimand. Vlad interpreted it as something far larger: a woman neglecting her fundamental obligation, a symptom of the laziness and disorder he was determined to eradicate from his kingdom. He had the wife brought before him. She was physically capable, without illness or infirmity. In his judgment, no justification existed for her failure. The punishment was immediate and extreme. Some versions record that he ordered both her hands severed, ensuring she could never work or fail again. Others claim she was impaled, converted into yet another public warning. Regardless of which account is precise, the meaning was identical. Under Vlad's rule, the distance between a domestic shortcoming and a death sentence had been reduced to nothing. Another account, preserved in a Slavic manuscript, describes a widow discovered in public speaking and laughing shortly after her husband's burial. For most observers, this could have been grief expressing itself through nervous energy, or simply a woman seeking the comfort of human contact. Vlad perceived it as defiance. He declared that her conduct insulted the memory of her dead husband and violated the moral framework he was determined to enforce. He sentenced her to death through a method that reflected his particular cruelty. He ordered her body opened so that he could inspect whether a faithful heart existed within her, or only the emptiness he had already judged. The execution was framed as an examination, a perverse attempt to demonstrate that her interior nature confirmed the verdict he had already passed on her exterior behavior. Even allowing for the distortions introduced by hostile chroniclers, the underlying pattern holds firm. Vlad regarded women not as individuals deserving protection, but as functional units within his system. If they labored, obeyed, and conformed to his rigid expectations, they were invisible. If they did not, their bodies could be repurposed as instruction for everyone else. Before we follow the final chapter of Vlad's life and trace how his memory was reshaped into a global myth, I want to point you towards something worth your attention. If stories like this pull you in, real power, real blood, real human beings crushed between the gears of history, then you deserve a physical connection to this world. In the pinned comment, you will find a link to what I believe is the definitive dark history volume for any serious collection. This is not a casual paperback. It is a dense, substantial book filled with the most ruthless figures, the bloodiest chapters, and the darkest conspiracies humanity has ever produced. It is the kind of book you can set on a table and feel the gravity of centuries in your hands. If you know someone who considers themselves a history expert and thinks nothing can surprise them anymore, this will prove them wrong. Or keep it on your own nightstand as a nightly companion of terrible truths you open before the lights go out. If Ancestral is the kind of content that keeps you watching, you will want this within reach. Hit the link in the pinned comment and add it to your personal archive. Because we are not finished with Vlad. Not yet. We have watched him terrorize an empire, lose his wife to the cliffs of Poenari, and become a prisoner transformed into a printed monster. But the final act of his life, the manner in which his head was separated from his body and sent to a city he never ruled, and the way modern tourists now wander through castles searching for a vampire who never existed there, that part of the story still remains. And running through all of it are the same unresolved questions. What does history choose to remember? What does it choose to bury? And why do the women who suffered most under his reign still stand in the deepest shadows of his legend? Vlad's years in Hungarian custody were not spent chained in a stone pit, but the cage was real nonetheless. Inside the castles and fortified residences of King Matthias Corvinus, he had a front-row seat to a different machinery of power, this time operating from the western side of the chessboard. Matthias needed Vlad alive because a living hostage has leverage that a dead one does not. Across Europe, Matthias was selling himself to Rome and to every Christian court as the great bulwark against Ottoman expansion, explaining why he had imprisoned one of the only rulers who had actually made the Sultan flinch required a narrative, a justification printed and distributed at scale. And that is exactly what appeared. In German market towns and Central European trading cities, small books and folded pamphlets began rolling off the new Gutenberg presses. They told of a Wallachian prince who feasted calmly at long banquet tables, while thousands of impaled victims surrounded him in every direction. Woodcut illustrations showed him eating with steady hands as bodies hung from stakes in the background, executioners severing limbs just paces away. Every new edition sharpened his outline into something less than human. Figures were exaggerated. Anecdotes were distorted. But the central thesis embedded itself permanently. Vlad was not merely a harsh ruler. He was a phenomenon that exceeded the normal vocabulary of cruelty. Political necessity and genuine memory tangled together into something inseparable. Survivors who had witnessed his methods firsthand provided raw material, and then printers amplified, embellished, and repackaged those accounts to move more copies. The man who had spent his career wielding terror as a strategic instrument now found himself imprisoned inside a terror narrative he had no power to edit. He had become a printed demon before his physical life even reached its conclusion. And buried beneath all the outrage over his monstrousness, the actual faces of his victims, especially the women who had been worked to collapse, impaled in public view, or cut apart in the name of social order, receded into the background. The monster occupied center stage. The lives he destroyed became set dressing. Eventually, the political winds around Matthias shifted direction. The Ottoman threat never disappeared, and the courts of Western Europe wanted capable men willing to confront it. Practical considerations intervened as well. Alliances needed strengthening. Marriages needed arranging. Borders needed redrawing. Vlad was not abandoned to permanent confinement. He was eventually released and bound through marriage to a woman connected to the Hungarian royal family. The strategy was unmistakable. Rehabilitate him, transform the savage of the pamphlets back into a usable Christian prince. Vlad did not return to power as the overwhelming force he had once been. He was older, scarred by defeat and years of enforced stillness, but he still possessed something that no other available candidate could offer. A name that made the Ottomans hesitate and made his own neighbors lose sleep. With Hungarian backing and regional allies, he mounted a final campaign to reclaim the Wallachian throne around 1476. For a brief window, the crown was his again. But the country he stepped back into was not the one he had left. And neither was the man wearing the crown. The Wallachia that received him bore scars layered upon scars. Entire generations had grown up knowing nothing but cyclical warfare, raids, and the constant rotation of rulers. The boyars had perfected the art of survival through calculation, reading the direction of power the way farmers read weather, committing loyalty to no one permanently. Families had surrendered sons to the Janissary system, watched their fields reduced to charcoal by scorched earth campaigns, and lost daughters to slavery or coerced marriages across borders. Vlad had once used terror to hammer society into rigid alignment like iron nails driven through planks. Now the entire structure groaned and shifted no matter how much force he applied. The accounts of his final months are fragmented and frequently contradictory. Some describe renewed military operations against Ottoman positions. Others record clashes with local rivals seeking to unseat him before he could consolidate. What every account shares is a pervasive sense of erosion. The terror that had once compelled absolute obedience had exhausted its potency. When a ruler relies on extreme cruelty as his primary instrument for too long, the population does not quietly love him. It quietly waits for the first viable opportunity to be rid of him. That opportunity arrived without warning. In late 1476, Vlad was killed either in open combat or in a sudden ambush near the contested borderlands between Wallachia and Ottoman-monitored territory. The precise location and exact date remain subjects of scholarly disagreement. Some later traditions claim he fell during an engagement with Ottoman raiding parties. Others suggest his own soldiers struck him down in the confusion of battle, mistaking their prince for an enemy combatant. A few darker accounts propose that nobles who had long lived in fear of him turned their blades on him deliberately in a moment of chaos. What carries the greatest weight is what happened to his body afterward. Whoever delivered the killing blow, his enemies recognized the strategic value of his head. According to multiple traditions, it was severed from his corpse, cleaned, and preserved in honey to prevent decomposition during transport. This was not a gesture of care. Honey was a practical preservative for organic material over long distances. The head was then carried to Mehmed II in Constantinople. For the Sultan, this was far more than a military trophy. Years earlier, he had ridden past the forest of the Impaled and been unable to keep his eyes on what Vlad had constructed. Now the face that had authored that nightmare was delivered to him stripped of everything: voice, will, power, threat. Sources indicate the head was mounted on a stake and displayed at the city walls or in a prominent public location where passers-by could confirm with their own eyes that the Impaler was finished. The man who had used stakes to broadcast messages across an entire region ended his existence as one more head on a pole in the capital of the empire he had spent his lifetime opposing. In that single image, the circle completed itself with almost literary precision. But the stories surrounding Vlad were only beginning their centuries-long expansion. In the territories closest to Wallachia, his memory settled into something that resisted simple categories. Some regarded him as a vicious tyrant whose reign had been a sustained nightmare, particularly for the vulnerable. Others, especially in later centuries, chose to emphasize the strong hand that had kept roads safe and foreign armies at a distance. Many people held both interpretations simultaneously without contradiction. A monster who had also functioned as a shield. For the women who had lived under his authority, the memory carried a different texture entirely. A noblewoman forced to drag cut stone up the slopes to Poenari under armed guard, watching the skin of her palms split and bleed until the rock was red. A peasant wife who understood that a poorly sewn garment on her husband's back could become her death warrant. A widow condemned because her grief did not perform itself loudly enough, sentenced to be cut open so a tyrant could claim to inspect the loyalty of her heart. Their experiences were never reproduced in woodcut illustrations. Their suffering never became a best-selling pamphlet circulated across printing houses. It remained local, whispered within families, or buried in silence until no one remained to whisper it at all. Historians working through later centuries unearthed documents that preserve some of these smaller episodes. In one account, Vlad's men encounter a woman begging in public, claiming her husband has died and left her destitute. Rather than offering aid, Vlad orders an investigation and discovers she possesses an unused inheritance. He has her impaled for deception. In another case, a woman conceals a lover while her husband is away. When Vlad learns of it, the consequence is not social censure. It is mutilation and execution. Again and again across these records, women surface as the primary targets of a ruler consumed by control. In Vlad's own framework, these punishments were not random outbursts of sadism. They were components of a comprehensive system. Every person occupied a designated function. Every function carried specific duties. A wife was required to clothe her husband properly, to mourn with appropriate gravity, to avoid conduct he classified as shameful. If she failed, the entire architecture of order was threatened. That conviction allowed him to reclassify a domestic shortcoming as an offense against the state itself. And once that reclassification was accepted, there was no ceiling on the punishment that could be justified in the name of stability. This is where the connection between the killing fields and the household becomes impossible to ignore. The same intellect that designed the impalement of 20,000 human beings also determined that a single woman's needlework or a widow's laughter could constitute matters of life and death. The extreme terror projected outward against the Ottomans was constructed on a foundation of smaller, constant terror imposed internally, directed most often at those with the least capacity to resist. Centuries accumulated. The Ottoman Empire expanded and contracted and eventually dissolved. Borders were redrawn repeatedly. New nations and new rulers emerged from the wreckage of old ones. But Vlad's legend adhered to the Carpathian landscape like a stain that no amount of time could dissolve. Foreign travelers copied older accounts and introduced fresh distortions of their own. Some reimagined him as a pure national champion. Others cast him as a blood-drinking fiend, operating beyond the limits of humanity. Almost no one thought to ask what had actually happened to the ordinary people ground to dust between his methods and the empire's ambitions. In the closing years of the 19th century, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula and a handful of vague references to a savage Wallachian prince. He blended these fragments of history with regional vampire folklore and the machinery of his own imagination. From that fusion emerged the fictional Count Dracula, an immortal aristocrat entombed in a Transylvanian castle, sustaining himself on human blood, recoiling from sunlight and crucifixes, pursuing women he desired to possess for eternity. The historical Vlad III had no connection to coffins or nocturnal transformations. He died the way countless mortal rulers died, violently, on a contested piece of ground. But his name had been permanently welded to the fantasy. Hollywood later seized Stoker's creation and industrialized it into a global icon. Black capes and ivory fangs, hypnotic gazes and candlelit corridors, Gothic castles photographed through soft atmospheric filters. Tourists began arriving in Romania not to understand Wallachia's centuries of survival between two empires, but to search for the real castle of Dracula. Most were directed to Bran Castle, a visually dramatic fortress perched on a cliff that was never Vlad's primary residence and may have had little or no meaningful connection to him during his lifetime. Gift shops materialized, stocked with plastic fangs, wine glasses printed with blood drops, and disposable cloaks sold by the hundreds. On the surface, this is harmless entertainment. People enjoy being frightened in controlled environments. They enjoy the theater of horror when it carries no real consequence. But something more troubling lives beneath the surface. The fictional vampire kills because a supernatural curse compels him. He is a predator, governed by hunger or dark magic. The historical Vlad killed as calculated communication. He arranged bodies to transmit specific messages to specific audiences, and those messages were inscribed on the flesh of real human beings. On the backs, the chests, the wombs of women who were not mysterious immortal brides, but mothers, daughters, wives, and servants, who woke one morning and discovered they had been reclassified as raw material for a prince's political theater. When visitors stand on castle ramparts today and pose for photographs with novelty fangs, they are standing above terrain where women once hauled masonry until the skin separated from their hands. When they joke about sleeping in Dracula's chambers, they are walking through a region whose villages once watched wives and daughters marched away to be impaled or sold across borders. History does not resent this. History has no feelings about it at all. But if accuracy matters to us, those echoes deserve acknowledgement. The fear that Vlad embedded in his enemies did not dissolve with his death. For generations in parts of the Balkans, parents invoked his name the way other cultures invoke the creature under the bed. Behave, or he will come. That kind of cultural persistence does not grow from legend alone. It grows from events that scored themselves so deeply into collective memory that even after the politics and the dates have been forgotten, the visceral warning remains. There was once a man willing to go further than anyone else. And this is the final uncomfortable truth. Vlad did not invent the cruelty he practiced. He did not originate impalement. The Ottomans employed terror systematically. So did other Christian monarchs of his era. Wallachia itself had endured violent rulers before him. What set him apart was the totality of his commitment to fear as his primary language, and the deliberateness with which he used women's bodies as vocabulary within that language. He looked at the categories of people traditionally considered protected: wives, noblewomen, peasant mothers, widows, and saw not individuals to be spared, but instruments capable of shocking powerful men into paralysis. That is why any honest conversation about Vlad cannot stop at the simple question of hero or villain. The deeper question is, what happens to a civilization when terror becomes routine? What happens when those in power persuade themselves that cruelty is not a last desperate measure, but an efficient strategy? The bodies that once filled the field outside Târgoviște are long gone. The fortress of Poenari is a crumbling ruin. The blood that stained the Danube washed downstream centuries ago. But the logic that permitted those acts persists wherever authority treats human beings as instruments rather than ends in themselves. So the next time someone mentions Dracula and smiles about vampires haunting the Carpathian Mountains, remember this other version. Remember the boy surrendered as a hostage by his own father, the man who converted his homeland into a weapon, the ruler who sentenced women to death over garments, tears, and rumors. Remember the Ottoman soldiers who saw their deepest fears materialized in the bodies of impaled mothers. And remember the wives and daughters whose names were never recorded, whose final sight of the world was from the top of a wooden stake, looking down at a road they would never walk again. If you have stayed with this story to the very end, thank you. You are the kind of person who refuses to look away when history turns brutal, and that matters more than you know. If you want more investigations like this, stories that dismantle legend and expose the real decisions, the real bodies, and the real cost of power, make sure you are subscribed to Ancestral and press the like button. It signals to the algorithm that dark history deserves a place on this platform. Send this video to someone who still believes Dracula is nothing more than a romantic vampire. Let them see what stands behind the mythology. And tell me in the comments, after everything you have heard today, who do you believe Vlad III truly was? A desperate defender driven to extremes by impossible circumstances? Or a man who chose to become something monstrous? This is Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world, and we are nowhere near finished digging.